Blackbeard used smoke and fuses to look like a devil. But François didn't need special effects. He was the devil. Born as a piece of property in the French colonial machine, he escaped slavery only to turn the Caribbean into a slaughterhouse. History's most chilling moment isn't his raid on Maracaibo, but what happened on the road to Puerto Cabello. When Spanish prisoners refused to speak, Lolone sliced open a man's chest, ripped out his still-beating heart, and began to gnaw on it like a wild beast to terrify the survivors into submission. This wasn't just madness. It was a calculated tactic of total terror that made him the most successful and hated man on the Spanish Main. But the ocean has a way of balancing the scales. Today, we're uncovering the brutal life of the man who ate hearts to break empires, and the poetic, gruesome end that saw the eater finally become the prey. Before there was a monster, there was a contract. 6 lines of text, written in the legal French of the 1650s colonial administration, describing 3 years of a man's life as a unit of labor. 3 years of obligatory service, after which the free state, without right to leave the plantation without the master's permission. The system was called engagé, indentured technically, not slavery in the eyes of the law. The distinction mattered to lawyers in Paris. On a Martinique sugar plantation in July heat, under a foreman with a stick, it did not matter at all. Jean David Now was born around 1630 in Les Sables d'Olonne, a shallow Atlantic fishing port on the French coast, where the boats dried on sandbars at low tide and the docks smelled of salt cod and rot. Not a nobleman, not a merchant's son. A peasant with the ocean visible from wherever he stood, and no future visible beyond it. The colonial recruitment agents worked the port taverns with a single pitch. Sign here, cross the Atlantic, and after 3 years, you are free. Free of what exactly, they did not specify. Free with what resources, they did not mention either. He signed. He crossed. He worked. What the 3 years produced was not a reformed man or a grateful colonist. It produced someone who had learned that the only reliable currency in the colonial Caribbean was the willingness to absorb violence and apply it without hesitation. The plantations of Martinique and Saint-Domingue ran on gauges and enslaved Africans through the same fields, under the same heat, at roughly the same rate of attrition. The barracks were separate. The lesson was identical. When the contract ended, Now discovered the freedom he had purchased. He had no money for a return passage to France, no position waiting for him on the plantation, and no documentation that distinguished him from anyone else who had arrived with nothing and remained with less. In the colonial register, he became a blank line after a completed entry. The only person who knew his name was the plantation agent, who no longer needed him. He walked to the coast. He bargained for passage on a fishing schooner. He arrived at Tortuga, a rocky island off the northern coast of Hispaniola, where the French colonial administration had made a deliberate, pragmatic decision to let buccaneers and freebooters operate in exchange for informal coastal defense against the Spanish. It was not paradise. It was a hierarchy. Hunters who worked the forests occupied one rung, freebooters who worked the sea another, and captains stood above both. Newcomers were not welcomed. They were tested. Now did not make an impression immediately. He was small, unremarkable, and did not complain. Exactly the kind of man a captain takes on for a first raid because he costs nothing and asks nothing. He found his place in a crew, signed aboard, and went out. The first raid ended badly. The ship caught a storm off the coast of Campeche in Mexico, ran aground, and the crew was cut down by Spanish soldiers on the beach. What happened next is the first moment Exquemelin, the surgeon-turned-chronicler who would eventually document his entire career, records about him directly. Now lay down among the dead. He did not move. He lay in the sand, covered in blood that was not entirely his own, while the soldiers walked between the bodies and left. Then he crawled to a nearby Spanish settlement, found different clothes, persuaded several enslaved men to escape with him, stole a canoe, and paddled back to Tortuga. No heroics, no speech. Just a man who decided to survive and did what was necessary. When he returned to the Tortuga docks, arriving on a stolen canoe in someone else's coat. A single old sailor with a fishing net looked at him, said nothing, and turned away. That silence was worth more than any formal reception. It meant now had been noted, measured, and provisionally accepted into a world where being left for dead and walking back from it was the closest thing available to a letter of recommendation. He would not use his birth name again in any document that survived. On Tortuga, he became Lolonais, the one from Olon, the town that made him, reduced to a suffix. The rest he built himself. Tortuga in the early 1660s was not anarchic. It was transactional. Governor Bertrand d'Ogeron had just received a new mandate from Louis XIV's West Indies Company, stabilize the colony, increase the issuance of privateering licenses, and project French maritime power into the Caribbean without spending French naval money doing it. The logic was simple and cynical. Paris could not afford a Caribbean fleet, so it licensed men who could afford to be violent, took a percentage of whatever they brought back, and wrote careful letters home about defending French interests. The register for 1663 lists 47 licenses. Most captains signed them and sailed before the ink dried. Lolonais received his commission not as a reward, but as a tool. D'Ogeron needed men who would go out and come back with something. Lolonais was available, had survived worse than most, and, critically, did not require explaining twice. He got a small vessel and a destination. What he developed on those first independent raids was not a style of violence so much as a system of it. The distinction mattered enormously to the men who had to decide whether to talk. The logic ran as follows. Prisoners who spoke quickly lived longer. Prisoners who did not speak died in ways that made the next prisoner reconsider his position. This was not rage or sadism in the way later accounts preferred to frame it. It was applied psychology, as cold and functional as rationing gunpowder. The men who sailed with him described, through Exquemelin's careful notation, a captain who paused before each decision, reached a conclusion, and executed it without visible emotion. A captain who is unpredictably violent is dangerous to his own crew. A captain who is predictably, purposefully brutal is at least comprehensible. On Tortuga, comprehensible was close enough to trustworthy. Then the governor of Cuba made the mistake that turned Lolonais from a known name into a legend. A 10-gun brig with 87 soldiers was dispatched with specific orders: destroy the pirates operating along the Cuban coast, take no survivors except Lolonais himself, who was to be brought alive to Havana. The brig found its target in the mouth of the Rio Estera. What it did not account for was a night attack in silence. Paddles lifted clean from the water, men who had spent years learning to move through darkness without sound. By morning, the brig was in pirate hands. Of 87 soldiers, 1 man remained alive. That man was kept alive deliberately. He was given a verbal message to carry back to the governor of Cuba. Exquemelin records the content: "I shall never henceforward give quarter to any Spaniard whatsoever." Whether the 86 heads were actually stacked on the beach before his departure, as Exquemelin claims, or whether this detail grew in the retelling, the Colonial Archive in Havana offers no entry for the governor's response to this message. Just a blank line in the register where the brig's return should have been noted. Silence, in a bureaucracy, speaks precisely. The survivor reached Havana on a life raft 5 days later. What he reported transformed Lolonais from a coastal irritant into a named threat in the dispatches flowing from the Caribbean to Madrid. The Council of the Indies, the Consejo de Indias, compiled losses from French buccaneer raids between 1664 and 1666, over 500,000 pesos in seized cargo alone, not counting destroyed infrastructure. A memorandum was written recommending strengthened coastal defenses. It was sent to Madrid. A reply came 6 months later. It was already too late. Meanwhile, d'Ogeron was navigating a different problem. Word had arrived from Versailles. France and Spain were in trade negotiations, and privateering raids were to be officially suspended. D'Ogeron duly issued the corresponding order and recorded it in the register. Then, 3 weeks later, he issued a new license to Lolonais under different wording. For the defense of French Caribbean interests, same result, different sentence. Versailles did not know. Cartagena suspected. Maracaibo would find out. L'Ollonais was given not one ship this time, but a fleet, 8 vessels, between 400 and 600 men, the largest French buccaneer operation the Caribbean had yet seen. His co-commander was Michel Lebasque, experienced, disciplined, and, as it would turn out, considerably better at knowing when to stop. The target was Maracaibo, already raided twice in 1614 and 1642, and still the wealthiest accessible point on the Spanish Main. A third raid wasn't coincidence. It was a statement that the system designed to protect that city had failed completely, and everyone on both sides of the water knew it. The fleet left Tortuga at dawn. D'Ogeron stood on the dock and counted the ships, not the men. The men, by that point, he had stopped counting. Maracaibo had been raided twice before. That fact lived in the city's architecture, in the way valuables were stored, in the reflexes of its merchants, in the unspoken institutional memory of a colonial port that had learned, twice, what it meant to hear strange sails on the horizon. By 1666, hiding silver was not a panic response in Maracaibo. It was a habit. The city knew the drill the way a man knows to close shutters before a storm, not because he thinks about it, but because his hands remember. What the city did not know was that the man coming this time had read its habits and planned around them. The fleet intercepted a Spanish treasure ship before it even reached Venezuelan waters. 40,000 piastres, jewelry, and cacao. The entire raid had technically paid for itself before the main operation began. Among the crew, this produced a quiet, dangerous idea. They had the money. The fleet was intact. The sea was open. L'Ollonais let the thought circulate for exactly as long as it took for men to finish the calculation themselves. Then he set course for Maracaibo without calling a vote. Turning back required his permission. Going forward only required following the ship in front of you. Most men, when the choice is framed that way, go forward. The fort at the entrance to the Maracaibo Lagoon had 16 guns and a garrison oriented entirely toward the sea. It had been designed by engineers who understood maritime assault, angles of fire, range, the geometry of ships approaching from open water. What it had not been designed for was a landing party moving through mangrove swamp in darkness, appearing behind the gun emplacements from the direction of the land. L'Ollonais led that party himself, in silence, through black water that smelled of mud and rot, while the fleet sat visible on the horizon as a deliberate distraction. The fort's commander divided his attention between the ships he could see and the threat he could not, and by the time he understood the geometry of what was happening, the gates were already open from the inside. The fort fell before morning. 19 defenders died. The rest retreated toward the city. Maracaibo itself was almost empty. The governor had received advance warning, riders had come ahead of the fleet, and ordered residents to remain in place. Roughly half obeyed. The other half, applying the institutional memory of 2 previous raids, quietly disappeared into the jungle with everything they could carry. The docks were deserted a full day before the fleet entered the lagoon. A merchant locked his shop, buried a strongbox under the floor of his storeroom, and left without witnesses. As it turned out, there were dozens of such strongboxes buried across the city. Finding them was the next problem. L'Ollonais knew this pattern. He had been told about it by men who had participated in previous Caribbean raids. The empty city, the hidden gold, the population dispersed in the forest, waiting for the visitors to leave. The standard response was to search houses and move on. L'Ollonais had a different approach. He sent parties into the jungle. What followed over the next weeks is documented by Exquemelin in his 1674 account, with the flat precision of a man recording medical observations. Captured residents were questioned about the location of hidden valuables. Those who answered lived longer. Those who did not were made into an argument addressed to whoever was standing nearest. Exquemelin writes one sentence about the method, without commentary or visible disturbance, as though describing a surgical procedure. The narrator reads it, then a pause, then continues. The city that remembered 2 raids had prepared for a third. It had hidden its gold, evacuated its people, buried its records. What it had not prepared for was a man who treated its preparations not as an obstacle, but as a map. Follow the hiding. Find the hider. The hider knows where everything is. It was a logic so simple, it was almost administrative. After 2 months in Maracaibo, the fleet moved deeper into the lagoon. Gibraltar, on the eastern shore of Lake Maracaibo, had 500 soldiers waiting. It had advance warning. It had a defensive line positioned across the approach. It had numerical superiority over everything Lolone could bring to shore. It had all the right pieces in all the wrong places, because Lolone didn't come from the direction the line was facing. He came through the swamp at night, again, from the side that the defensive architecture had not accounted for. The battle lasted until morning. Spanish losses, approximately 500. Pirate losses, 40. When the colonial report from Cartagena reached Madrid, 19 days after the fall of the fort, by which time the fleet was already deep in the lagoon, it contained 4 sentences. Maracaibo fallen, Gibraltar fallen, garrison destroyed, reinforcements requested. The 5th sentence, about what was happening to the residents still being found in the jungle, was not included. Some things were easier to leave out of official correspondence. Exquemelin did not leave them out. Gibraltar burned behind them. The smoke from the tobacco warehouses rose in a column visible 20 miles out on the lake, thick, dark, slow-moving, the kind of smoke that doesn't dissipate so much as settle. The fleet loaded what remained worth loading and turned back through the lagoon toward the sea. 2 months of operations, 2 cities, 40 dead of their own, 500 of the enemy. By any accounting that buccaneers recognized, the Maracaibo raid had been the most successful French privateering operation in the Caribbean to that point. But Lolone was already planning the next one. He returned to Tortuga in late 1666, with holds full enough to satisfy d'Ogeron's percentage and a reputation that had outgrown the island entirely. The Spanish colonial administration in Cartagena had a name for him now in their dispatches: Flot des Espagnols, the scourge of the Spaniards. The Council of the Indies issued a formal recommendation that no negotiation be entered into with him under any circumstances. This was, in its way, the highest possible endorsement. It meant he had graduated from irritant to policy problem. He spent months on Tortuga assembling what he intended as the definitive operation. Not a raid, but a sustained campaign into the Central American mainland. Honduras. 700 men across multiple vessels, the largest force he had ever commanded. Where Maracaibo had been an island campaign with clear maritime escape routes always available, the mainland was fundamentally different territory. Jungle, rivers too shallow for his ships, distances that swallowed supply lines, and Spanish soldiers who had learned, over decades of frontier warfare, how to use all of it. The fleet landed at Puerto Caballos on the Honduran coast in 1667. The town was empty, the pattern by now so familiar it almost felt like a greeting. The residents had been gone for days. The wells were still cold. Somewhere in the surrounding forest, riders had already left for San Pedro Sula, carrying the news. Lolone had perhaps a week before whatever was waiting inland had time to prepare. He moved his men into the jungle and began following the river route toward San Pedro. What he encountered instead was a Spanish ambush at a river crossing, soldiers positioned on both forested banks, firing down into the narrow path of advance. The vanguard took casualties and fell back. Lolone regrouped and attacked again, fell back again. This was not Maracaibo, where his opponents had fixed positions and predictable firing lines. This was adaptive, patient, terrain-based resistance. Soldiers who melted back into the jungle after each volley and materialized somewhere else. After the second failed advance, Lolone took 2 Spanish prisoners. What followed is recorded by Exquemela in a single paragraph, in the same uninflected register he used to describe weather and cargo manifests. One prisoner spoke. He provided what he knew about the route, the garrison size, the location of the next defensive position. The other prisoner refused. Lolone drew his cutlass, opened the man's chest, removed the heart, and held it toward the surviving prisoner's face. Exquemelin does not editorialize. He does not pause to characterize the act as madness or strategy. He simply records what happened and what the surviving prisoner said immediately afterward. Everything he knew, in full, without hesitation. This is not the most violent thing Exquemelin documents about Lolonais. It is the most deliberate, because the point was not the dead man. The point was the living one watching, and through him, every prisoner taken on that road, and every Spanish soldier in the jungle who would eventually hear the story. Terror, applied with enough precision, functions as a multiplier. One act, correctly placed, does the work of 10. Lolonais understood this the way a carpenter understands leverage, not as philosophy, but as a practical matter of getting the job done with the tools available. The prisoner's information led Lolonais to San Pedro Sula. He arrived to find the city evacuated and burning. The Spanish commander had ordered it torched before withdrawing, leaving nothing worth the march. Ash, jungle, and a rising sick list. For the first time in a major operation, the ledger did not balance. The fleet had spent months on a mainland that refused to hold still, defend itself in convenient places, or leave its valuables behind for collection. Several men disappeared from camp overnight. Not many, but enough that the number was noticed and not spoken about. Lolonais pushed the remaining force south along the coast, looking for something that would justify the expedition in any terms he could present on Tortuga. Near the Nicaraguan shore, his fleet intercepted a Spanish galleon, the only meaningful prize of the entire Honduras campaign. His men boarded it in the kind of hard, exhausted silence that comes after months of diminishing returns. The galleon was real. The hold had cargo. For a few hours, there was a number to point to. Then the storm came. The galleon, heavy and unfamiliar, ran aground on the Mosquito Coast in conditions that a more nimble vessel might have survived. It broke apart on the shoal. The flagship, the center of the fleet's command, supply, and symbolic authority, was gone. 700 men stood on a coast that none of them knew, staring at wreckage, with no obvious way home. Lolonais ordered them to salvage the timber and build smaller barks. It would take weeks. While the work proceeded, he took a party inland to find provisions. The jungle closed behind them, and for the first time since the beach at Campeche, where he had lain among the dead 20 years earlier, François Lolonais walked away from the sea and did not come back. The barks took 3 weeks to build. Men worked in rotating shifts on the Mosquito Coast, breaking apart the galleon's hull with tools salvaged from the wreck, cutting timber from the tree line, trying to construct vessels seaworthy enough to carry what remained of 700 men back to Tortuga. The work was quiet, not the disciplined quiet of a crew with a destination, but the particular silence of men who have stopped talking about what went wrong because the list has grown too long to recite. Lolonais did not supervise the construction. He had gone inland with a foraging party to find food. Provisions had been critically short since before the storm, and a coast with no settlements and no obvious supply line was not a problem a famous reputation could solve. The party moved through jungle that offered no landmarks, no paths, and no indication of how far the nearest inhabited ground might be. This was not the managed wilderness of a Caribbean island, where the sea was always audible and the horizon always findable. This was the Central American interior, deep, autonomous, indifferent to the distinction between a buccaneer fleet captain and any other warm body that walked into it. The Spanish were waiting, exactly how the ambush was organized, and by whom. The surviving sources do not specify with precision. What the accounts agree on is the outcome. Lolonais' foraging party was engaged by a Spanish force of sufficient size and preparation to suggest advance intelligence. Several of his men were killed. The rest scattered into the jungle. Lolonais himself escaped, for the moment. The same instinct that had kept him alive on the beach at Campeche, lying motionless among dead men while soldiers walked past, had not abandoned him entirely. He moved, regrouped fragments of his party, and worked back toward the coast. But the coast had changed while he was gone. The news of the ambush had reached the men building the barks, not as an official report, but as rumor, carried back by survivors in ones and twos. On a ship with a functioning hierarchy, This kind of news can be managed. On a beach with no ship, no clear command structure, and no shared destination, it behaved differently. Some men finished the smallest of the barks, loaded what they could, and left. Not desertion in any formal sense. The articles they had signed were for a specific raid. The raid was manifestly over, and no one was going to court-martial a buccaneer on the Mosquito Coast. They simply went. By the time L'Ollonais returned to the beach, the group that remained was a fraction of what had set out from Tortuga. He led what was left of his fleet along the coast in the smaller vessels, searching for something. A settlement to raid, a ship to intercept, any transaction that could be converted back into the language of success. The coast offered almost nothing. A few minor captures. A Spanish bark with a modest cargo. Numbers that could not be made to look like the Honduras campaign had been anything other than what it was. A slow, expensive failure that had consumed 7 months. One flagship, dozens of men, and most of the strategic credibility he had accumulated at Maracaibo. D'Ogeron in Tortuga had received no dispatches from the fleet for over 3 months. In the port taverns, the assessment had quietly shifted from expectation to uncertainty, and from uncertainty to something closer to arithmetic. 3 captains who had planned to join the campaign after it began had never departed. The harbor master had stopped reserving anchorage for the returned fleet, a trading dispute that L'Ollonais' name would previously have resolved simply by being invoked, because no one wanted to be on the wrong side of a man who returned from raids, was now proceeding through the Admiralty Court in the ordinary way. His name had stopped doing its work. L'Ollonais eventually reached the Gulf of Darien, the inlet on the Colombian coast that marked the edge of the Panamanian Isthmus. Whether this was a deliberate strategic choice or simply the result of following a coastline with nowhere better to go, the sources do not agree. What they agree on is that he put men ashore again. He needed provisions. He needed a route inland. He needed, at minimum, something to bring back to Tortuga that did not look like the last year of his life. The Kuna, the indigenous people of the Darien region, were not the passive local population that European accounts tended to render as backdrop. They had been in contact with Spanish colonial forces for over a century, and in that century had developed a precise and functional hostility toward anyone who arrived from the sea with weapons and intentions. They had watched the Spanish. They had watched the buccaneers. They made their own calculations. L'Ollonais' party moved inland and did not return. What happened in the Darien forest exists in a single account, Exquemelins, written several years after the fact, based on testimony from the few men who escaped and eventually reached Tortuga. The details Exquemelin provides are specific enough that historians treat them as grounded in something real, and ambiguous enough that the line between documented fact and what people wanted to believe about the end of a man like L'Ollonais is genuinely difficult to locate. The party was surrounded, cut off from the coast, reduced by fighting and flight over several days to a remnant. And at some point in that reduction, the date unrecorded, the location unspecified, François L'Ollonais, the man who had eaten a heart to break his enemy's will, encountered people who were not afraid of him, had never heard of Maracaibo, and had no use for his reputation whatsoever. The jungle, it turned out, did not read Exquemelin. Exquemelin writes the ending in 1 paragraph, not because he lacked material. He had spent 300 pages on the Caribbean, its captains, its violence, its accounting, but because the ending of François L'Ollonais does not require elaboration. It requires only the right sentence, placed without ceremony. The Kuna of the Darien did not operate according to the logic of the Spanish Main. They had no governor to appeal to, no colonial register to update, no diplomatic correspondence to write. They had a forest, they knew, with the precision of people who had lived in it for generations, and they had watched enough men come out of the sea with weapons to have developed a clear and workable policy regarding what to do with them. L'Ollonais walked into that forest with the confidence of a man who had survived Campeche, Maracaibo, and Gibraltar, and who had learned that survival was a skill transferable across any terrain. It was not. The survivors, a small number of men who managed to reach the coast and eventually make their way back to friendly waters, brought Exquemelin his account. What they described was a disintegration. The party harassed, divided, and reduced over days by people who knew every path, every river crossing, every place where a narrow track between trees created an angle of fire that had no good answer, not a battle, an erasure. The kind of ending that happens not in a single dramatic moment, but in the accumulating arithmetic of fewer men, fewer options, and less ground to stand on. And then, at the end of that arithmetic, Exquemelin writes the sentence that made his account famous, and that publishers in London and Amsterdam printed and reprinted because their readers could not stop talking about it. He writes that L'Ollonais was set upon, killed, torn apart, and eaten by his captors, that the man who had removed a living heart from a Spanish prisoner on the road to San Pedro Sula was himself consumed, flesh divided, bones discarded, in a jungle on the edge of the Darien. Whether this is precisely what happened, historians have argued for 3 centuries. Exquemelin was not present. His sources were traumatized survivors telling a story months or years after the fact, in taverns and ship cabins. To a man with a pen who had learned that dramatic precision sold better than documented uncertainty. The Kuna did practice ritual cannibalism in specific ceremonial contexts, which lends the account a plausible cultural frame. But plausible is not the same as verified. The Archivo General de Indias in Seville, which contains colonial reports on buccaneer activity throughout this period, has no entry for L'Ollonais after the Honduras campaign. He does not appear in prisoner lists. He does not appear in ransom negotiations. He does not appear at all. He simply stops. In the colonial record, the absence of a man is its own kind of document. What Exquemelin understood, whether as historian or as craftsman, was that the ending was not incidental to the story. It was the point. A man who used the consumption of a human body as a psychological weapon against his enemies ended as something to be consumed. The symmetry was too precise to be ignored, too poetically satisfying to be left unwritten, and too deeply rooted in the genuine facts of his final campaign to be entirely dismissed. The Caribbean had a way of producing these endings, not just for L'Ollonais, but for almost everyone who operated in it long enough. Morgan's grave went into the sea at Port Royal. Blackbeard's head was hung from a bowsprit. The ocean and the land beyond it did not grant exceptions for reputation. D'Ogeron received word of the fleet's dissolution sometime in early 1668. He recorded the relevant figures in his register: losses, outstanding debts, unclaimed shares from the Maracaibo campaign. With the same bookkeeper's precision, he applied to everything else. The license issued to L'Ollonais was not formally revoked, because there was no one to revoke it from. It simply expired by absence, like a debt that outlasts the debtor. In Tortuga, the taverns talked about it for a season. Then they moved on. There were other captains, other licenses, other raids being assembled at the docks. The harbor master had new vessels to record. The name L'Ollonais appeared occasionally in subsequent years, in pamphlets, in sermons warning against ungodly lives, in the margins of Exquemelin's book where readers left notes, but as reference, not as present tense, a fixed point that other stories triangulated from, not a story still in motion. He had arrived as a blank line in a colonial register, a man without documentation, without family connections, without the name he was born with. He left as a sentence in someone else's book, vivid, debated, impossible to fully verify, and impossible to forget. The Caribbean had made him from almost nothing. Then, with the patience that large systems apply to men who mistake tactics for permanence, it unmade him the same way. Portobello still stands. The road to San Pedro Sula is still a road. The Darien is still a forest. Somewhere in it, unmarked, unrecorded, and definitively beyond the reach of any admiralty court, lies whatever the jungle decided to keep.